Right. So I think we are actually live and recording. And yeah, I will trim off anything we don't use at this beginning.
Okay, here we go with the intro then. Welcome to the publishing rodeo where we say the quiet part out loud. We have we have Richard Swan with us, the author of Justice of Kings and the Tyranny of Faith, out from Orbit Books.
Hello.
We Hi, Richard.
Hi, Scott. Hi, Sonia.
Hi, Richard.
So we are going to try to focus the conversation today on the anatomy of a bestseller, and in particular, a bestseller with a debut contract, right? And we have two Sunday Times bestsellers here with us, both Sun Yi and Richard. Were you? I don't even know that I know the difference. But were you instant bestsellers, or how did that go? You can take turns talking about that before we launch into it, I suppose.
Yeah, Richard first, go for it.
Sure. Yeah. I would say it was a week one bestseller, and then dropped out of the chart like a stone. So, which was expected. But yeah, it was. I think if you sort of appear in the week, I think if you appear in the list in the week that your book is actually published, then it's an instant bestseller. So yeah, I was. I don't know.
It was
Were you?
instant for me too. And I think that's because
Okay,
all your pre-orders stack up. So really
that's right.
impressive as it sounds to be bestseller out the gate, your best
Mm,
shot at being bestsellers when you launch. And
that's
then,
right.
like Richard, I was there for 1 week, and the week after, the bestseller list was swept away by a collective tidal wave of Stephen King, Colleen Hoover, Richard Osmond, and J.K. Rowling.
Oh wow, you didn't have
Yeah.
a chance.
Oh, no one did. Number 10 on that list that week was some guy that only sold 20K copies, who, that's 5
Ah, that's a
times
shame.
the copies I sold to get
So
on the
that's it.
bestseller list, but he couldn't compete with 127K out the gate like Richard Osman, so
My God,
I
I'd had
know.
Richard Osman was the capstone to my efforts on the Amazon bestsellers ranking. I nearly got to number one on Kindle. That I say nearly, didn't nearly, but got to like number 8, and Richard Osman was number 7, and I was like, well, I'm not going to dethrone him. So he is also my nemesis on the bestsellers rank.
For Americans who don't know, Richard Osman is a very popular actor, comedian here who also writes cozy mystery books, and boy, do they sell like water in a desert.
Oh my God, yeah.
I had no idea, but that's
That is
not
great.
news. I've already had to Google things that Richard has said in the the pre-record chat room.
Expanding your vocabulary one word at a time, Scott.
Indeed, yeah. Thanks, Richard. Appreciate it.
That's okay, mate. Yeah, it's fine.
So, Richard, can you give us a bit of an overview of your journey to publication? And Sunny and I know bits and pieces, but feel free to give the story to us in whatever level of granularity you wish.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, you might regret that addendum.
Oh, I'll cut you off.
That's great. Thanks. And moving swiftly on. I started when I was a wee lad. I was born in North Yorkshire in 1989. I started writing as a child, like a young child. But I remember kind of my sort of first concerted effort was in my young teens, and I started writing science fiction. And what I considered was a novel then, but actually was probably about a sort of collection of short stories. And it just kind of I sort of decided I was going to write, and I wrote a story, and then I wrote another one, the following year with a friend, which ended up being quite long. It was sort of like 150,000 words or something. And then when I was in my what we would call sixth form, when you're sort of 17, 18 at school, I wrote what would become the kind of the blueprint for my writing ever since. And I wrote a sort of 136,000 word space opera, which was called Mindscape. And that really completely sort of cemented for me how I would approach writing as a kind of as a structure, as a actually way of kind of getting the words down on the page. And I had like a plan, so the plan that I used for that is still kind of the format of the plan I use today. I use kind of color coding for the different kind of POVs, which I don't do anymore, but I did then. And it was a kind of, a 3-act structure with kind of interweaving storylines and stuff like that. So that kind of really set the basis of how I would approach writing ever since. And then after that, I sort of spent about 2 or 3 years on Black Library fan fiction forums, writing huge amounts of Warhammer 40,000 fan fiction, about 5 or 6 novels worth. And then that forum went down; they closed it, and so then I returned to kind of my own IP, if I can use that, and there followed my self-publishing phase. So I self-published some stuff for a couple of years, 3 or 4 years. And then so I think it was about 18 books at that point, and then book number 19 was the Justice of Kings, which when I wrote the Justice of Kings, I kind of sent it to a friend and I said, hey, what do you think of this? And he said, I think it's I think it's really good. And I said, I might just self-publish this one as well. And he said, well, why don't you try and get an agent or try and get it published for 6 months, and if you don't get anywhere with it, then you can always self-publish it. That's always an option for everybody. And that turned out to be really good advice. And so I tried to get an agent, and and then I got one, and then I got a publishing deal. I mean, we might approach these things in more detail, so I don't want to sort of hit the granularity on the deal at this point. But yeah, it was pretty smooth sailing from that point. Everything just kind of fell into place. And I was about 15 years after I sort of first started writing, I think 16 or 17 years. So yeah, it's been about a 20-year journey, and that time always the goal was traditional publication. That was always the sort of the guiding star. And weirdly enough, also Orbit. I think that the first book I submitted when I was about 14, I sent a book into Orbit because I had a connection there. A friend of my grandma's neighbor knew someone who worked at Orbit, weirdly, editorial. And so I sent them this dreadful kind of teenage written manuscript, and I was like, hey, yeah, I love a book deal. And they were like, God, no thanks. And it was a letter. You sent the manuscript off. This was only, even when I was a teenager, it was a manuscript in a jiffy bag, and then sent the letter back saying, no thanks. So I wish I'd kept that letter. Actually, I should have had it framed. But yeah, so that was it. In a nutshell, that 20 years sort of from start to finish, that was my journey.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is an okay time to talk about how getting an agent went and how the contract with Orbit came about. If
yeah, absolutely.
Whatever
yeah, of
details
course.
Yeah.
It was a very painless process for me, and I only learnt. Sorry,
people are gonna love you, Richard.
I know it's a story I don't sort of volunteer that often, because I only learn months after the fact. Because of course, as writers, I was never part of any writing group or critique group or writers circles or workshops or whatever. I never did any of that. Writing was always been a very solitary pursuit for me. And so now I am a published author. I know more authors and writers than I have ever done. And so now I have a much kind of keener eye on kind of the industry and what goes on in it. And I had no idea that people could be waiting on submission for months, even years sometimes. I had no idea that was a thing, because my personal journey was so smooth. And so yeah, the agent thing, I submitted it to one agent. I submitted it to 3 agents in the end. I think it was 3. It certainly wasn't more than 3, but it might have been 2. It was one guy. I think I've never heard back. Go on, son, you look like you about to say something.
Sorry, I'm watching Scott's face. Oh my god!
And then they just wheeled this big dump truck of money outside my house. And they said, Richard, please just write books in perpetuity. Here's a blank check. I applied for one agent. I don't even remember his name, but I never heard back. It was a kind of open, almost like an open window, or like a competition or something. I don't know I can't even remember what it was, but that went nowhere. And then I applied for. What I did was I just went on the internet and I just literally Googled science fiction and fantasy agents. And a bunch of names came up, and there were listicles and things. And I was like, right, this will do. I just picked one. No idea what I was doing at all. Just picked one. One came up, and I applied for him, and he said no. He passed on it. So I did get one rejection. to be fair. And then the second agent I applied to was Harry Illingworth, the DHH agency in London. So he and I actually had a share. Funnily enough, he and I had a friend in common, which I didn't realize at the time. But we missed each other. We were the same year at school, not the same school, but different schools. But so we actually were much closer in age and kind of experience and everything than I first appreciated. But I sent him an email. He asked for the full manuscript. Then he asked to have a phone call, and I just immediately accepted. We had a kind of conversation. He was like, "I'd love to represent you," and here are my edits, kind of thing. So that was a very smooth process, and it didn't occur to me even slightly to shop around either. I just said, "Yep, this guy seems like he knows his stuff. He's legit," and he is like he's
Yes,
brilliant.
yeah.
Just to be
He's a
clear,
good agent.
he's like he's an excellent agent. Absolutely no problems with him at all. Glad that I have him. If you're listening, Harry.
He's definitely not just you with a different email address.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Hello, I am Mr. Snrub. Yeah, so he's great, and I'm really glad that. But it was complete chance. I didn't know agent shopping. I just I got Harry. I was like, fantastic, and I was vibrating with excitement. I couldn't sleep that night. I was like, oh my god, it's happening! It's happening! It all seemed like from there it was smooth sailing, and to be fair, it was. So I was right to be excited. And then we went on sub. So we spent about a month or two. I spent about a month or two on edits. He said, it needs to be more explosive. The ending needs to be more explosive. We need to have a battle or something. Let's get that in there. Put a battle in there, and went on sub. And he submitted it to the big five to start off with. So your Orbits, Tors, your Galants, and Hopper Voyager, and whatever. And I think because it was August, I think a bunch of them were on holiday. And it went to James at Orbit, and he came back quite quickly. So I think it went out late August, and from what I've seen the email chain between him and Harry, and I think James came back maybe a week and a half later or something, saying, "I like it. Keep me posted. If you hear from anyone else, any other editors, let me know." And then a deal came in almost exactly 1 month after we sent it out on the pitch out, and that was a preempt. So that's for those who don't know, that's a kind of they get in before anyone else gets a chance to make an offer. So they say, here's a big sum of money for you to completely remove the pitch from the market, and we'll keep it. So that's what happened. And Orbit offered it was a six-figure sum of money for the 3 books, and we did a bit of negotiation to get that number a little bit higher, and that was that. So it was very, very smooth sailing, or just hitting every kind of dream target in the space of several months. Agent to offer. Sorry,
Man,
Scott.
but at least someone gets the dreamboat story.
Yeah.
And for me, that's part of it. It's like, I know you've not had a chance to hear the last 3 episodes, but basically, there's probably more bad stories than good in publishing, but good stories do happen. And sometimes things work out, and that is what we all hope for.
That's right. And I think, ultimately, being published and having this kind of this has been my dream, for decades, literally 2 decades. This is something that I've been working towards for a very long time, and so yes, it was a very quick and smooth process, and yes, lots of people have terrible deals, absolutely, but it doesn't kind of. I wasn't just like a kind of random 21-year-old TikTok kind of eminent, just hit out of nowhere and was like, oh, hey, I wrote, I've got 1 million followers and here's a 6-7 figure, deal. This is, I don't want to invalidate my success by kind of, because I have been working towards it for a long time. So, things did fall into place very nicely, but that is the culmination of a lot of work as well. Like a lot of work.
I've not written 18 books, so
No, sure, and it's not, that's not the be all and end all, of course. And some people can just write 1 book and it'd be wonderfully good. And I think because a huge part of the reason why I've written so many books is because I've been doing it for so long. For the longest time, it was just a hobby for me.
It sounds like you had a wild adolescence.
Stories I could tell you.
Well, you did. Yeah.
If these walls could the more interesting stories I could tell you.
Yeah, no, I totally get what you mean. Like,
Hmm.
you have definitely put in the work, and I think that shows, right? I've read your books and unfortunately loved them.
Thank you, Scott.
Yeah,
Scott
you're
and
welcome.
Richard are nemesis officially, for those
Yeah,
who
We
that's
don't
hate
right.
one another in secret.
Yeah.
We just
No,
pretend to be simple.
Is it a hate or is
everybody
it a sexual tension? We're all undecided.
Richard seems to attract a whole lot of nemesis, but no,
Nemesis.
really, yeah, shut up, Richard. Really, I really like Richard. For the record, and that can go on record.
I
But
don't like you, Scott.
I appreciate that too. Honesty is very valuable. The funny part of that story is that when things go wrong, right? Like I would say they did for me, and they do for so many others. The uh, I think the temptation or the tendency, at least in my case, is to look back and think, what could I have done better? Where could I have mitigated the risk? What I should have researched more. I should have known more. I should have been more involved. Whatever. So it is really just hilarious to hear that you picked agents off a random list. Just sent, it was
Yeah.
some friend that read your book and was like, no, you shouldn't self-publish this one like the other 18. You should actually submit this. And you're like, oh, okay, yeah, maybe that's a good idea.
Yeah. Yeah, right. Yeah, okay. I'll try to get this one published. If you think that's a good idea, I'll do it.
If you insist, yeah.
Yeah, okay. No, that's
Yeah.
probably right.
That's good.
It is, and I think, like I say, but also it was about hitting the market at the right time as well. And so much of it is complete luck. And I think, I saw chatter online about medieval fantasy, which of course the Empire of the Wolf series, which is Justice of Kings, Tyranny of Faith, which very much is this sort of late medieval kind of fantasy. And there was this whole idea of medieval fantasy has kind of had its day. We're looking for other things now, and I don't think that's true at all. And when I was talking to my editor about it, when we had our first conversation after the deal was all kind of signed and we were getting into the editorial process, and he was saying what grabbed him about the book, what he liked about it specifically, and why they offered such a large sum of money for it, was it was what they used the phrase familiar but different. And I think that is absolutely spot on correct. If you look at fantasy, the genre as a genre, and what fantasy readers like, it's very rare that you get something that is really kind of esoteric, off the wall, zany. And occasionally it works, and it works very well. But more often than not, what you're seeing is broadly the same sort of thing being published. The same sort of old medieval cities, knights on horseback, swords and sorcery. And what they liked about mine was it just had an angle. Yeah, so it's familiar. We know all of the tropes. There's nothing incredibly unique about the setting in the Empire of the Wolf. It's a kind of broad kind of Holy Roman Empire, sort of Anglo-Saxon kind of medieval European setting that we are all very familiar with. But it's fantasy lawyers, right? And we haven't seen that before, or if we have, not in any great kind of detail or not in the same way. And that was the hook. It was that's okay, medieval, nothing groundbreaking there. Oh, fantasy lawyers who do magic. That's really cool. We haven't. And so it was to me and to my editor and to Orbit more broadly, it was about hitting the broad notes, but injecting something interesting and unique. And because I was a lawyer, I was a litigator for sort of 10 years, I was able to bring a lot of knowledge to that, and so they had a sort of verisimilitude to it that you wouldn't get as someone who was a non-lawyer, say. And I think that's always you can always tell when someone is an expert. When a doctor writes like a kind of a novel or whatever, that they know what they're talking about. And so I think I was able to kind of bring that to the book, and it had that angle. And I think if we're giving listeners or writers advice or whatever, it's find the angle. What they call the high concept, isn't it? You can still do medieval fantasy. You can do any kind of fantasy, but what's the new thing, the new slant that you're kind of putting on it, I think is why, in my case, it was as successful as it was.
I think I probably fall on the other side where I went full out on the weird a little bit. But yeah, I mean, I'll get into more because I do think that basically the ways in which my book hit list in the UK, I can't talk about the US side because I didn't hit list there. A lot of that was out of my control, but at least as far as the writing went, I did. I kind of, I don't know. I think I had this approach like any idea can work and it's structure that's commercial. And I don't know if that's true or not, but it has worked for me so far. So I spent a whole year reading thrillers because thrillers are the most commercial genre, and I was trying to understand why people like them, what makes them compelling, how they draw the plot forward, how they draw the reader in. And I had this belief that you could pair a thriller structure with a fantasy setting, even if that fantasy setting is a traditionally dead genre, because at the time contemporary fantasy was seen as dead. And this is how you've ended up with a book about vampires who eat books, but it's also like a thriller. And I kind of was gambling on the fact that if you can be cross-genre, you do get a broad audience. But, you know, everyone's trying to do that kind of thing, aren't they, to some extent? I don't know how much people think about market when they write. I'm not sure. I know that I think about it a lot. Because to me, the point of writing a book is to communicate with other people, and the way you do that is to have more readers, and the way you have more readers is to be accessible at different levels.
I didn't think about the market. That's interesting because I didn't think about the market at all, and I think a huge part of that for me was just the way I've approached writing, and because I've been doing it for so long, I didn't sit down as like a 30-year-old and think, right, my life's goal is to tell a story and have it published. I think, and I'm sorry, and I'm not saying that was what you did either.
No. I think you
But
can write in isolation, and that's very helpful in a way that you can develop your own voice. And I started writing at the same time I started looking into publishing, so I have always been shaped by the agent quest, the querying, the rejection letters that say not marketable, not marketable, not accessible, not commercial, and that I won't say it does damage. I will say that it shapes the way that you write and the things that you write for, and I don't think that's always good. There's definitely something to be said for developing your art and your voice without that hideous publishing influence commercial hanging over you.
I think that's absolutely right, and the reason I agree with that is because and again, I've never done that. I've never written to market. I'm very late to the publishing process, and so I've always hitherto I've always just written for myself as a hobby and read my own stories and enjoy them, or when I was self-publishing, even when I was self-publishing back in sort of 2015, my space opera, I never had any kind of editorial, because now these days with the indies, they hire freelance editors and they have cover artists, and it's a cottage industry of freelancers who kind of come together and have all of the same apparatus as a publishing house, but it's all just freelancers coming together and sort of briefly coalescing around novels. But I didn't have any of that. I had a proofreader, so there'd be no errors and mistakes, but I never had any kind of editorial oversight or anything, and it was all very much just like this is my book, I've enjoyed writing it, and let's just see what happens. And I think for me personally, and I'm not saying either way is right or wrong, I think for me personally, when you have spent so long writing and you've only ever really been writing for yourself, and you have developed your voice in that more organic way, what tends to happen, I said this to someone else the other day, if you write what you want to write, if you love what you're writing, you will write a good book. Good books are commercial books, and commercial books sell. And it's obviously a bit reductive to say that, but I mean, I think it's broadly true. And as you know, Sonia, I've been writing a contemporary novel which I've absolutely loathed writing, and I've absolutely hated the process of writing that. And it's been a real drag, and it's been so difficult to write it. And that is me writing to market. That's me writing what I think a commercial thriller should look like, and it's been excruciatingly painful. I've absolutely hated the creative process of that, and I finally finished the thing yesterday.
That was my process for trying to write an epic fantasy as well, and why I bailed on it in the end. Even though epic fantasy is a better sell, I just couldn't do it. But I guess it's that you got to draw the line for what you're willing to do on it.
Yeah, right. but so I've never written to market. And the one time I have, and God help me if this ends up being my most popular book, I'm going to jump off a bridge. But the
I'll
one
hold you
time
to
I,
that.
Writing.
yeah, that's a binding contract. You can't. It's void for illegality. You, the one time I did try and write to market, I suffered greatly. Even creatively, I detested the process. So it's interesting. My advice would be, never write to what you think the market wants. Just write the book that you fucking love, because that will end up being your best work.
So this is really interesting because I, being friends with you both, have tried to look objectively at what I enjoyed in each of your books and what may have contributed, and you hit on every aspect that I had come up with, and in particular, you both seem to enjoy, the high concept thing of a distinguishable theme or elevator pitch, whatever, that comes across very quickly. But what I think doesn't happen as much as you might think in genre fiction is the depth that you both talked about. And people talk about not just writing what you love, like you're talking about, but writing what you know, right? And in your case, Richard, you mentioned that fantasy lawyers
So help me.
was your thing, right?
Yes.
And you really could and did write about that authoritatively, because you understand that world and you could kind of model your experience in a fantasy setting. And it's obvious, at least to those of us like me who aren't great students of history, it's obvious that you had at least a rudimentary understanding of
Sure.
several empires or civilizations in the past, and
Absolutely.
studied them to some degree,
Mhm.
and you had something to say about how they formed, how they functioned, and in the end how they might decline, right?
Mm. Yeah.
Which is really interesting. And you, Sunyi, your book was I know you're very, very humble about your book, but in my opinion, it was extremely powerful because of the aspects of motherhood and parenthood, and what it looks like to care for a child even when the circumstances aren't ideal, and the depths that somebody would go to protect their own, even when that might not be quote unquote for the greater good of any given society, what it might be like to be a relatively oppressed person, etc. And so we talk about write what you love, but I think, at least to me, that aspect of both of your writing came through very, very clearly and very powerfully, where it was obvious, even though it's not, you writing necessarily your life story
I wish.
or projecting yourself into the book. It was very obvious that both of you did harness your own understanding of a certain set of
Mm.
potential situations, and put that into your writing, and
Absolutely.
it worked, right?
I think, yeah, certainly some of the earliest writing advice I got was write what you know, and I hated that advice, because I just wanted to write about spaceships and people getting blown up and stuff, and I didn't know anything about that, except for what I'd seen it in cinema and played on computer games. So it's very aggravating to find that actually was good advice, all these years later. I think you're absolutely right, Scott. And I think when you do bring something that you do know a lot about into your fiction, you know, it adds that sort of quality to it. But you can absolutely write quality fiction without knowing about something. You just got to research it, right?
Sure.
I remember a good example. I think is I thought William Gibson in Pattern Recognition did an excellent job of describing kind of a London, like a near future London, or a sort of contemporaneous London. And it transpired he'd never been there, or certainly not for the purposes of writing this book. He had just got his Google Street View out, spoken to some people who did live there, and he'd done an excellent job of. I had assumed he had spent 2 or 3 weeks in the city, but he hadn't at all. And so it is possible. I think when you're doing a deeper dive into a character, or a situation or whatever, that you do have personal experience, and it obviously adds to a lot of, it rounds out the novel in a way that maybe you can't quite achieve if you don't share that experience. But it's not to say it's insurmountable.
Authenticity.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, so one of the other aspects you both touched on was structure, and I know, Sunny, you in particular you pay very close attention to structure. Do either or both of you care to go into kind of some of the familiar patterns or patterns you've settled on in your work, and what seems to work for you? Sunny, I know you talked about thriller structure, but what does that mean to you?
I write to something that we've talked a bit about in private, which is kind of the reader's journey, and it's not a set template the way Hero's Journey is, but it's basically this concept that everything in the book exists to engage the reader, and if that means the plot is told out of chronological order, I will do that. So that I can control the withholding information. If that means changing point of view, changing tense, I don't worry about it. I just do it. The only thing that matters to me is propelling the reader through the story, to tell it in the most engaging way and to keep their interest. And I think if you actually read some of the thrillers that have done really well, they have sometimes surprisingly characters with flat arcs, but the story is told in such a way that the reader is experiencing an arc of emotion, even if the character isn't experiencing an arc of progression. And so for me, that was an important part of writing. I don't know if that works or if the book was a fluke. We'll find out with the next one. I do tend to write in 4 or 5 act structures because I like having a double climax. That sounds rude.
Don't we all?
Like, well, you know what I mean. But yeah, and just I guess things like that. I'm trying to stay out of craft too much, but
Yeah.
those are things that work for me. I try not to be too formulaic. I think there's a risk of that happening. You can fall into your own traps and kind of ruts.
Yeah, I've read at least most of that second book, as you know, and book one, your first book, was not a fluke, not at all.
Okay. Thanks.
I think for me personally, when especially because I've written a lot of trilogies, or certainly that's kind of like my default setting, I always think of, in terms of structure, book one needs to stand relatively by itself, because that's the book that most people will read. And then, you always get drop off, and it can be quite a significant drop off between books 2 and 3. So for me, a trilogy is book one, and then books 2 and 3 are really 2 halves of one story. And so when I was approaching book one, I was like, I want to have an investigation that is basically self-contained, so that by the end there is a resolution that a reader can feel satisfied with. But then a broader trilogy arc, which spans the whole series. And I tried to kind of mimic that same structure in book 2, because I thought it worked very well for book 1. And I wanted to have another investigation in book 2 that started and finished within that book. So again, having something that concludes, because notoriously lots of book 2s don't really conclude; they just set up book 3. There's actually a detestable phrase called middle book syndrome, which I've come to completely loathe, because it's part of the tropification of reading and reviewing books, is coming up with kind of phrases that often don't really apply. And so the sort of the success of a book will live or die on how much middle book syndrome, what percentage. It's a completely nonsensical phrase. I hate it, but anyway. So I wanted to avoid that sort of thing, where you have a book without a beginning and an end, by giving it a beginning and an end, at least internally. So contriving for that to be the case. But really, books 2 and 3 are 2 sides of one coin, much more so than you have a trilogy, but really it's book 1 and then books 2 and 3, rather than book 1, 2, 3.
Yeah.
So I was conscious of that structure as I approached it, and and then within the books, I follow a classic 3-act structure, and I always have done. So that was how I sort of tackled the Empire of the Wolf. And I think, to be fair, my sort of self-published stuff had exactly the same thing as well. So that's kind of the way I go about things. But that's not to say I haven't experimented with different structures before. One of the things I have done, a bit like Sun Yi with her thriller kind of examinations, is I do like to end chapters on cliffhangers. And sometimes it can wind people up a little bit because it can be a bit kind of a bit cheeky and a bit kind of lame if you do it too much. But it's a great way of just keeping people hooked. What you have to avoid is having it be a false climax, so like just resolving it in a really lame way at the very start of the next chapter, because then you're just going to piss people off. But I did try and kind of add a little bit of a cliffhanger at the end of each chapter to kind of pull people through the novel at quite a quick pace.
Yeah, no, I've noticed. I'm not quite all the way through Tyranny of Faith, but I've noticed the similar structure to book one. Not hard to notice, but I've noticed.
Yeah, sure, yeah. It's
no, I mean that in a very good way.
No, I know you do. I know. A child could have noticed this this simple structure.
Indeed. Okay, so if you two are okay with it, I'll move us into what I think people are tuning into this podcast for, which is the business side of it and your experience with your publisher and things. So going kind of to the beginning, Richard, what did the contract negotiations look like with Orbit when it came in? And did you, I'm guessing the answer is no, based on what you said thus far, but did you do anything or see anything that made you optimistic that they would follow through with everything that you expected of them? Or was it really just, oh, that's a good amount of money, let's sign?
There was there was definitely an element of that's a good amount of money, let's sign, for sure. And I think my agent was obviously optimistic in terms of when he got the manuscript. He obviously liked it because he offered to represent me. I don't think either of us were expecting the deal that we got, out of the gate. And so the contract itself was, probably a pretty standard contract. I don't remember Harry saying anything like, oh, this is a bit weird. And I think the fact that it was Orbit, a large, reputable science fiction fantasy publisher, did a huge amount of the heavy lifting to us. I come from a corporate background as well. I was a management consultant. I was a lawyer. So and contracts are my bread and butter. So I didn't, the only thing I looked in that contract and I thought, I don't like that, was the reserve on returns clause, which for the uninitiated is, the way I understand it, and Sun, you or Scott, maybe you'll be able to correct me if this is wrong, but the way I understand it is, there came a point some years ago where publishers and bookshops kind of reached this agreement, and that was kind of supposed to be the best of both worlds, where in order to give everybody certainty, a publisher will say, I want to sell you Waterstones or you Barnes and Noble, 10,000 copies of X book. And Waterstones were like, well, there's no way I'm going to buy 10,000 copies of it because we might only shift 5, and then we've bought 5,000 copies we're never going to shift. And so the solution was, okay, well, you can return the books that you don't sell. But hold on a second, that seems like a terrible deal then for the publisher and also the author. So then they capped that to 12 months. So you can return the books that you don't sell, but only within a year. And I think that's, unless I'm wrong, I think that's kind of an industry standard aspect.
It is in the States. I think it is in the UK. In the States, I think it's as long as the book is in print, but functionally that's a year or less in a lot of cases.
Yeah, right. Because I mean, it's certainly with the hardcover, for example. So in my case, when I look at the data, I only have sort of granularity on the data from my US book sales. But when I look at the returns of the books that went back to Orbit, they were like 95% of those were hardbacks, and I think obviously hardbacks are the most difficult thing to sell, especially in debut. So that would make sense to me. I think, broadly speaking, maybe it's codified as a year in the UK, but realistically, it's not going to be much longer than a year in the States either way, because it's mostly the hardbacks that go back anyway. But the reserve on the returns clause was like, if a book of yours is returned to the publisher, they pass that back onto you. So they reserve a portion of your royalty payments to account for the fact that some of your books may be returned to the publisher. And I sort of saw that clause and I was like, that seems like bullshit to me. That's a kind of like that's a risk that the publisher should shoulder, not the author. But apparently that was completely standard clause in industry contracts, and so I just had to eat it. But the contract itself was I'm given to understand, a very standard one, and there was obviously some negotiations about getting royalty rates up and all the rest of it, and the purchase of the all of that. So all those sort of numbers went up to a degree. But in terms of my personal involvement, it was very minimal. I obviously had to approve the contract before we agreed to it because it was my name on it. And in terms of, did I trust Orbit to fulfill their end of the bargain? Absolutely, and they have. To be fair. And
well, so the
Oh,
reason I asked that is because that's not always the case, right?
No, right.
Yeah. So, and I happen to know that Sun Yi, you had a very good marketing plan that was put together and presented to you. And Richard, I don't know whether you had a plan like that, but I know that Orbit did some really cool things for your release. Were those marketing plans, or even just verbal ideas for how this was going to be promoted? Was that communicated to you two at time of acquisition and contract, or did that come later?
Because our preempt had to be done for Tor in about 3 or 4 hours, I went on trust with Naomi, where Naomi basically said, Lindsay is a friend. I think this person is right for you, and I trust Naomi, and I do think Naomi's right. I think there's a reason why so many people want Lindsay for an editor. She's amazing. On the Harper side, the UK rights for us went a lot slower. So I'll mention this distinction because I think we have slightly different deals. Where I think Richard has sold world rights to Orbit, and that has some benefits in some things. But I'll let him explain that in a minute. So my rights were parceled up. My UK rights went to Harper Voyager, and while there was kind of a mini auction between Titan and Harper, which I don't think Titan realistically could have won, but anyway, Harper actually sent a document to us while that was going on, because auctions are very slow in publishing. They take days. And this document was something they called a marketing deck, and I had never seen a marketing deck in my life because I'm not a marketing person. It was like, what do you call them? The PowerPoint slides. It was a series of PowerPoint slides where they detailed basically their vision for the book, how they imagine marketing it, the kind of readership it would have, the kind of blurbs it would have, the kind of cover and art, and the things that they could offer and that they could bring to the table. And when I saw that document, when you get those rejections from editors where they say, I don't have a vision for this manuscript, that was the moment where I understood what that word meant. That vision was this kind of document. That vision is, you need, basically when editors say I have or don't have a vision for a book, they're thinking the whole package. They can envision cover, marketing, blurbs, campaigns, adverts. They can see what this book would look like in totality were they to pick it up. So yeah, we had that strong sense from Harper from that. And when I could see their vision for the book, because I don't have marketing vision, I don't have a fucking clue how to sell anything. I was like, okay, wow, I've never seen my book in this light before as a product, the way that they see it. And I was kind of impressed. So, we did have those reassurances on both sides. Yeah.
I think, I had a sort of similar experience, actually. I think, after the deal was done, I had conversations with marketing, the team, both in New York and in London. And then they also presented, my agent asked for, but they were going to give me one anyway, a marketing plan, which was a sort of fairly granular kind of email, which detailed what they were going to do, both on social media and, separately in terms of stuff that I wouldn't see. So they said like you'll see the social media stuff because we'll tag you in it, whatever. And they also gave me like a social media guide as well. Like this is the kind of thing you should be doing. You should change your Twitter handle to your name, for example, because it wasn't my name before. It was like Zwan, ZWAN, for example. Change your Twitter, have a photo professionally taken, blah blah blah. But we're also going to be doing this behind the scenes. We're going to be spending some money on ad place, targeted ads, blah blah blah. They did like in conversation with RJ Barker, I think it was, they sort of set that up at the Times, contemporary of mine at Orbit, and they did a whole bunch of stuff. So we had several meetings about it, about their ideas for how it would go, and had the same thing again actually for Tyranny of Faith. We had a call a couple of months ago about, and they were just telling me, right, this is our plan, this is what we're going to do, just so we are doing stuff. You're not going to be seeing a lot of it because it's going to be like targeted ads on things like Facebook and Amazon and whatever. But this is what's happening. So I was really, pleased and impressed with those efforts. It felt like they really kind of were putting their money where their mouth is. And I think also, Scott, actually, before we came on, you mentioned, and I had forgotten, but they did the limited edition ARCs as well, which was a nice touch. It was the they did a run of 100 signed ARCs. So I went into Carmelite House, which is on the Victoria Embankment on the Thames, which is where the Hachette office is. It's a beautiful office, and went in, and they had a stack of 100, special edition ARCs, and I signed them and numbered them, and that was it created buzz, right? And I've seen those books be traded in the aftermarket now for for actual sums of money, which is maybe unethical, but I thought it was really cool. And so they did a good job of building buzz and telling me what buzz they were going to build. So I was happy. I was happy with all of it. I didn't have a problem with any. I never felt like I was being kept in the dark at all.
I think the marketing meetings were the first point where I realized how different this route is going to go, because I think, they sent the document and they're like, oh, we're going to have the marketing meeting at this point in future. And I remember asking one of my critique partners who's mid-list, like, what do you do in these marketing meetings? And she said, well, most of us don't get marketing meetings.
What marketing meetings? Yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah.
That was part of the whole, like, okay, now I'm starting to understand the divide and how essentially privileged I was. Also, I was going to ask a quick question. You don't have to answer, Richard, but am I right in remembering that your contract was joint accounting? And if so, do you feel like explaining that for people who are listening?
I think so, and I think I understand what that is. Is that so? Basically, you don't earn any royalties until all 3 books have earned out. So it's not like
That's right.
and so that's it. So we sold world rights, which is a slightly different thing anyway. But I'll explain that too. So in a sort of, because I know that my agent initially offered UK rights, or maybe it was UK and Commonwealth. And this idea of, it's better for you as an author if you can parcel out your rights, because then more money flows to you, and it flows to you more or less and much more quickly as well. So with world rights, what you are doing is basically giving up everything, all over, well, as it sounds, all over the world, global rights to be published in any country. So Orbit own the rights to the Empire of the Wolf trilogy to exploit that novel in whatever form, audio, ebook, whatever, everywhere in the world. Now, that's not always a good deal for people. It was a good deal for me because they offered me a lot of money for it. And so we eventually, Harry and I went around the houses on it, but we decided to go for it. And I think Orbit, they like doing that because they're split across the UK and the US anyway. And there were some specific contractual benefits that were specific to Orbit as well in doing that. So things like US royalties, because normally if your publisher owns the rights and they sort of, shop your book in, say, Germany or France or whatever, your publisher then steps into the shoes of your agent, essentially. So they're taking a commission on foreign sales as well before they pass the royalties on to you. Whereas with Orbit, they don't do that in the US. 100% of it comes to you. So there was a tangent, and most of my sales are in the US. So it's orders of magnitude more than it is anywhere else. So that worked out very nicely for me, because I earn more money personally on my US sales as a result of being with Orbit, having sold them world rights. The downside to a world rights contract, and I'm sure there may be some agents or somebody listening who think this guy hasn't got a fucking clue what he's talking about.
Well, they're welcome
but
to come on and correct us.
yeah, exactly. Yeah, prove me wrong, kids. So we sold the book in like 5 or 6 territories. So there was a Spanish edition that just came out. There's a German edition that just came out. Other editions are in the pipeline. There's a Russian, a Czech, Polish editions, all translation editions. The downside to that is, for me personally, in terms of financials, the German advance was substantial. It was a lot of money. And it was going to be, and is, a lead title for a large German publisher. The downside is that money now goes to Orbit. It doesn't go to me. And so Orbit use that money obviously to pay off the advance that they paid me. But what it means is every advance or payment I earn in all these other countries flows through Orbit, and they use that to reduce the overall advance. Now, the overall advance was substantial, so I have nothing to complain about. But that money in another life with a different contract would have come straight to me. So that's the difference. So it's not necessarily a good thing if you're going to get, like, the all bells and whistles lead debut treatment, then it can be a really nice offer, but it may not
They're not going to
necessarily
publish
be.
your book in other countries, though.
Well, and that's it. And if they decide to just sit on the book, if it underperforms, and they sit on it, and they decide, well, we're not going to spend money on translating it, which is expensive, then you're stuffed, because then that's it. The book will then die. And so, but I knew that Orbit and Harry, in his conversations with Orbit and James, had said, well, look, I'm not going to give you world rights if you don't then exploit them. And obviously no one's going to guarantee that in the negotiation stage, but I had the sense, that they would make good on that, and they have. But mine's a best case scenario. Like, few people will get as good a run as I have had. And there are lots of, I'm at one end of the spectrum, and lots of people will be at the middle or the other end.
And I mean, in a good case, right? I don't know about best case, but in a success case, you'll eventually see the money still roll through to you in the form of royalties, and it's fine.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
But the risk you run, right, with Orbit paying off their advance, and obviously Orbit paying off their expenses to get your book to market, is that they can then relax, right?
Yeah.
And that seems to be the golden rule in publishing, is money hanging over a publisher's head is your only real form of guarantee, right?
Yeah.
Exactly.
So,
And I think that one of the, there's a double side. There's all these things. There's a risk, and you have to take and manage that risk and I was working in it full time. I'm a full-time writer now, but I was working as a lawyer, so there was much less. I was earning much more as a lawyer than I was as an author. But I completely agree. I think one of the good things about getting a large advance, there's a risk, right? There's a risk that you don't earn out, and if you don't earn out, and one thing that this industry has taught me is that nobody is untouchable. If your book underperforms, they'll drop you like a sack of shit. And so, but one of the good things about being paid a lot of money is that it's incentivizes the publisher to recoup what is to them a loss, an accounting loss, the advance, is to make good that loss. Now they can make that good. They can make good that loss much more quickly than you will. Orbit will have already earned. I'm almost certain they will have at least broke even.
They will,
on my series, and probably made a healthy profit already with 1.5 books out.
Yeah, they break even well before you earn out your advance, right? And I mean, they're gonna always structure it that way. Always.
Exactly that. Yeah. And I'm confident that that's happened. But the corollary to that is, if they say, yeah, well, you did, and I'm not saying that they would, because they're nice people, but well, you didn't earn out, so this time we're only going to offer you half. It's a big kind of, it's a big falsehood, isn't it? It doesn't actually reflect the commercial reality, because the commercial reality is they've made their money back and then some. But it's to stick to the carrot, isn't it? It's to say, well, you didn't earn out. So it's a bit of gaslighting almost. That we didn't quite earn out, so we're going to reduce the advance on the next payment, on the next deal, or not give you one. That's the precariousness of the author. And I'm not saying that that's what they're thinking, but publishers generally, will think in
it's
that
not
way,
in your
won't
favor. And at some point, I'll ask Evan Winter to come on, because he has some really good maths for the point at which you actually begin to make your publisher a profit, and it's a lot lower than most people think, or that publishers are kind of happy for you to think. And I'll just come back to circle back the joint accounting thing very briefly, because I think it's interesting for people to know. But yeah, basically, I mean, I have a joint accounting contract for Harper, but I have a separate accounting contract for Tor. And what that means is that each of my books is only, so I'm on a 3-book contract, and they're each earning out on their own stream. And to illustrate that, kind of, it's like if you say you get a 2-book deal, and you need $10,000 in sales for each book to earn out the advance. Book 1 sells $12,000 in sales, so it earns out. Book 2 sells $2,000 in sales and doesn't. If you're on a separate accounting contract, you'd be getting royalties from book 1 and not from book 2. If you're on a joint accounting contract, you're not getting any royalties, because you haven't earned out the total. So it's just there's a very, very few cases where where joint accounting is helpful. But I think it's like 80% of the time it's a clause invented by Satan to make you sad. And it just doesn't benefit you at all as a writer. But it is kind of standard across the industry. So especially for fantasy and sci-fi, where we tend to be in trilogies and duologies, or even like me, where I'm on a contract for 3 standalones, everyone will try and get joint accounting out of you.
Yeah.
It's a tough one.
As a brief aside, when you said 80% of the time there, I just saw in Scott's mind the Anchorman quote, "It works every time."
60% of the time, it works every time.
I knew it was right there in the forefront of his mind.
I would absolutely agree. I think, authors should know that single accounting or whatever you call the opposite of joint accounting or basket accounting is always the way to go. Basket accounting, joint accounting always favors almost always, I guess maybe somebody could think of a circumstance in which it's good for the author, but it always favors the publisher. One thing I wanted to mention with foreign rights, Richard, because you brought that up specifically, having given world rights, because I have experienced the other side of the spectrum, right? I had a very negative experience with respect to my publisher utilizing the rights that they got out of us and that they wanted when we first signed the contract and wouldn't give back. Anybody signing contracts right now that I've talked to, I've always said, try to get separate reversion clauses for every format and every version that you can. So whether, and I don't know whether that's something that publishers will sign. I don't know if that's something that agents will even try to negotiate.
You can ask.
Yeah, exactly. You can ask. And if it were me, I would have a separate reversion clause for audio, for territory. So I signed over world English, not world, but just world English, right?
Right.
And Tor didn't publish or shop, really, as far as I can tell, my book into the UK market. And so I wish that I had a reversion clause for the UK specifically. And they were very cool about reverting audio before they had to. But everything that you don't actually have in a contract is something you have to essentially go and beg for after the fact if it doesn't go the way you hope.
Yeah, there's some really odd stuff in my contract, but I won't get into that now.
I think it's, I think as an author, what you can always safely assume is that it's a commercial arrangement, right? So this is where the sort of the transparency really should exist within a publisher author relationship. And I think Orbit, my editor, was always very good at managing my expectations in this regard, and still does. He still does manage my expectations constantly. He'll never say when we do a deal. He'll say if we do a deal. Nothing is a given, and I appreciate that candor. I think once there's a temptation to think that once you're in, you're in. And in the reality is it's a business transaction, and we as authors should always have an eye on it as a commercial relationship, and it's a one of uneven bargaining positions as well, because most authors are desperate to be published, and a publisher wants to make money. And so when you're looking at a contract or any kind of and I know contracts intimately, when you're looking at any kind of contract, you can safely assume that it's structured in a way that benefits the publisher not necessarily to your detriment, but that's often what will be the result. And so they're not going to give you anything for free. They're not. If there's any way that they can avoid, like any service that you provide or any product you provide, no one is going to give up more than they have to. That's just capitalism, right? That's how it works. And this is not my kind of like smoking in a kind of dark room, nihilistic kind of, ooh, I'm so edgy. That's just the way the capitalism works. So every time you look at your contract, you can assume that your publisher is going to be looking to make as much money off you as possible and pay you as little money as they can get away with. It's not because they're bad people. It's because their duty is not to you, it's to their shareholders. And that's a legal duty. It's not even like a ethical or moral duty. They are legally obligated to act in the best interests of their shareholders, and the best way you act in the interests of your shareholders is to maximize share value, surprisingly enough. And to do that, you maximize your profit, and one way you maximize your profit is you minimize your costs, and your costs as a publisher are your authors, the advances that you pay to them. And so that was it's a separate discussion, but the whole idea of that big merger between whoever it was, Penguin and Simon and Schuster or whatever, the idea that that would be good for authors was just complete nonsense. Like, it was absolute corporate doublethink. It was complete rubbish. It would have been the complete opposite. It would have only been bad for authors because, as economics professors have long realized, monopolies and hegemonies are bad. They're bad for competition. They stifle competition, which is why they're illegal in a lot of countries. And so, when you're looking at your contracts, just always bear in mind that no matter how well you get on with your editor or how nice everybody seems, and obviously everybody will be nice, generally speaking, because we're all human beings and we like to be nice to each other.
Until they aren't.
Until they aren't.
Yep.
Ultimately, they answer to the publishing house. The publishing house is a company. The company answers to its shareholders. And that's the dynamic you are contending with. And for as long as you're making money for that company, happy days.
And I will throw out, I really admire and respect all of the individual humans I have worked with in publishing. I think my editors are incredibly smart, interesting, very informed people. They have good opinions on the books they're editing and all kinds of things, and all the publicists and so on. But, as the author, you are the person. It is your art, and you have to look after it. You have to look after your book, and no one will be as invested in your book as you are, not even your agent. And again, I love my agent, and I think they are an amazing person and an amazing advocate. But you're still your own first best advocate for your stuff, and you should be. And that you can have friendships with people in publishing, and you should respect them and treat them well. But this is separate from having business relationships and looking out for your business interests.
Yeah,
exactly.
That's a good distinction. We at the podcast are big fans of the individuals that exist within those corporations.
Blink twice if you're under duress.
No, I mean,
the line is just clicking all of a sudden. Anybody else?
Even when things haven't gone, exactly as I'd hoped, I've still been very fortunate to work with some fantastic people, make fantastic friends on the business side. Especially love my agent, and there are some really amazing people at Tor. But yeah, they exist within a corporate structure, and I think that's the point we're trying to get across, is that at the end of the day, we don't sign their paychecks. The corporation does, and that's going to sway their actions far more than any friendship will, if push comes to shove, and sometimes it does.
I'm just going to briefly interrupt because I'll cut this bit, but if you guys are okay to keep going, I'm okay to keep going as well. I think what we'll probably end up having to do is split this into 2 episodes, which is fine by me, but just have like a craft half and a business half.
I think also we should talk about getting onto lists at some point.
Yeah, because that's what I'm hoping to get onto as well. But obviously, it will be fairly long if that's all right with you both. And
I'm absolutely good to carry on talking. Yeah.
Okay.
I'm okay. The only thing I'll throw in is that I have one more question, and then I am out of material, so it's on you.
That's fine. I will be doing. I can do the list stuff because I've got
fine.
Some
I think
questions for Richard.
When we say Natalie a bestseller, people are probably thinking, like, what is the Sunday Times? Like, how do you get on it? Like, what are the numbers look like? And I think that's probably, if we don't actually include that in this podcast, people are going to be thinking,
oh yeah,
this is just Richard Swan talking about his publication journey.
That's fine. As long as you guys are happy
about that.
To be cut into 2 things, basically. I'll just do it into 2. You can release 2 episodes.
Blah,
right.
blah, blah, part 1.
Your last question.
Whatever, yeah.
Oh,
absolutely.
Yeah. Okay. So the only thing that I heard in there, and that I happen to know about you two, that I wanted to go back to, is things that publishers do, and that maybe upcoming writers can look for to judge whether they're going to be getting the success they hope for out of the publication journey, is arcs and other forms of hype or hype building activities on behalf of the author that your publisher's doing. So we talked already about, Richard, your publisher doing Orbit, doing those 100 numbered special edition arcs, which I thought was really cool. But besides that, you said that they gave out quite a few arcs besides that, right? And I think Sunyi actually had a number for her arcs that were given away as well.
I don't know the exact number. So we had Unbound Galleys first. That's like literally just printed pages that don't have a cover or anything. That went out very early, almost a year. And then on top of that, we later had arcs, which have a cover, and they look kind of like a book, but they're floppy and they're kind of smaller and lower quality print than a real book. And there were arcs on both sides of the Atlantic for that. But I think for me, the biggest thing is like, the biggest sign is that people are talking to you. You know how when you're in kind of Facebook writing groups or on Twitter and you hear people say like self-pub authors or querying authors or just basically people who aren't quite in the system yet, and one of their biggest fears is I'll get picked up by a publisher and then they'll edit my book to death and overwrite me and rewrite my book. And I think I understand that fear, but I don't think the thing you have to be afraid of is a publisher micromanaging you because they wouldn't bother. That's not a good use of their time. The thing you have to be afraid of. No, like why would they rewrite?
No, I
your
agree.
book
No,
when they
sorry,
could
I
just
agree.
get
It's very well
yeah, no, that's fine. They're not going to rewrite your book when they could just get a different author. Like they wouldn't do that. And the thing that I think you need, always the warning sign is not, is a publisher micromanaging me, because they don't tend to. It's, is a publisher acknowledging that I exist? Because if they don't give a fuck about you, that's when you're really screwed. If they don't notice that you exist, if you're sending emails, you don't get replies, you get vague replies. If they say things like, oh, we'll have a marketing meeting at some point, and then it's kind of like you just get one social media document or something, stuff like that is where I'd be concerned, where there's a lack of information, where it's vague. That's where I would tell people, yeah, they're kind of maybe sidelining you a bit.
I think authors would definitely generally be thrilled to have an overabundance of communications from the editor.
Oh yes.
Rather than the opposite problem, which doesn't exist at all.
Yeah, I love I love the edit letter that is big and heaving and has lots of things to change. I live in dread of the edit letter that's like, yeah, this is fine, we'll just send it to print, because that's
yeah, then you're absolutely. I think at the moment it seems to me that the way the world is going, and this is sort of not just in terms of publishing, but sort of the broader creative industries, there's becoming an increasing pressure to make a big splash immediately. And if you don't make a big splash immediately, that's deemed as a failure. So you're not like, this is a great book. What we're going to do is we're going to kind of organically manage this growth and kind of build your career up. Because I think the market is fundamentally different now than it was even 20 or 30 years ago. And I think, maybe the 90s was probably the last decade in which you could sort of comfortably be a mid-list author and still earn enough money to live on and pay your bills, and then some, probably, for some people. And I think now, as with many other aspects of life, this idea of side hustle and the working more than one job and whatever, this idea that we're shifting from author as a job to you do writing as as a part-time thing on top, aside from your main job. And so once you have that, number one, once you can bank on authors accepting that that's the system, you can pay them less, sure, and you can split out the advances into small payments, because it doesn't matter, because you're not dependent on that income. But also, number two, it's this idea that everything has to be massive or it's nothing. And it's not just writing, it's on TV as well. Like, there was a huge hoo-ha a few months ago when Neil Gaiman was like pounding the pavement on all social media playing, saying, everybody please watch, well, I can't remember the Dream Man, what was the
Sandman.
Thank you, Sandman. I didn't watch it, but I'm sure it's very good. Everybody please watch Sandman, because if it's not an immediate success, it's going to get cancelled. And that was true of like basically every big budget Netflix series now. That it's Cowboy Bebop. I was talking about it literally yesterday, because I actually really liked that series, but it wasn't as successful enough so that they shit canned it like after like a week or something. And I feel like publishing is almost the same. and part of it is just the vicissitudes of the market, and I kind of feel sympathy for the publishers to a degree, where they're like, right, we've got this debut, it's sink or swim, and it's a symptom of the marketplace being so crowded. There are so many books being published now, and not just traditionally published, but indie published as well. Like literally anybody can write and publish a book these days, so it's a hugely crowded marketplace already. And there is something to be said for saying, well, if you don't make a big splash from straight out the gate, you're just going to sink into the ether and never be heard from again. And there are 1,000 books that are going to fill that vacuum. And so I do kind of get this idea that you have to put everything behind the debut. You have to spend a little bit of money, put something behind the debut, really give them the kind of the push that you can get. And then, because the way that my editor said it to me was, we'll do all of this marketing stuff, right? But at some point, the book has to just catch on and self-sustain. We can't market it forever. We do a bit of marketing up front, we give it a push, and then it has to kind of just organically spread by word of mouth. That's the best case, scenario. You put some money behind it, and then the word of mouth spreads. And if it's a good enough book, which is true, if it's a well-written, good book that people like reading, it will find its market. People will talk about it, and it will spread.
Yeah.
And then you get the self-sustaining sales. That's the dream. That's the best case scenario. But what happens, often, is you either have the publisher say, we'll put some money behind this, and the book one comes out, and then, it's not quite done what we want. What do we do? Let's close the doors on it. Let's cut our losses immediately, and we'll just write off the whole thing. And then books 2 and 3 either don't really get released at all. They kind of get released quietly and then fade into the ether. Number one, or even worse, the publisher is like, we put some money behind it. We're not quite getting the traction we would like. Even before book one, there doesn't seem to be any hype. So we're going to close the doors a stage earlier still, and then even your book one is dead on arrival then, and then you're really fucked. But it's, the death spiral is a well-documented phenomenon within publishing. But and it all comes down to this thinking, part of which is artificial, and part of which just it reflects the reality of the market, which is that your debut has to go well. There's no like, okay, your first trilogy or your first book wasn't quite where we wanted it to be, but we think it's a really good book. We know it's a good book, hasn't quite found the market yet. So here's some more money, keep writing, and you'll build up, and that's either then you hit the mid list forever or you just die. But there's that kind of thinking doesn't seem to happen anymore. And maybe I'm wrong in that, but it does seem like it has to be all or nothing, from the get-go.
Yeah, well, I think on that, actually, I was going to... Oh, sorry, Scott, are you...
No, absolutely. Go ahead.
I was going to ask then, if you want to talk about hitting the Sunday Times list and your experience of that, because I think we could possibly compare notes on that, and I would find it interesting. And just, I guess we can give an overview of what the Sunday Times list is and how you get on it. And particular, I kind of want to know if you can answer this, when you knew you would hit list.
Yeah, I can answer. Yeah, absolutely. Oh, go on. Sorry.
I was just going to say, and the reason I asked that is because Book Eaters came out in August 2022. Mm-hmm. And I knew in January 2022 that we were going to hit list.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Just because of pre-orders?
No. Well, I think I hit list in a different way from Richard. So feel free to answer that question and talk about yours, and I'll go back to mine.
Okay, sure. It's an interesting one. It's a very much like how the sausage is made story. It's not the kind of like inspirational this is just a fucking incredible book and people kind of falling over themselves to buy it. I remember the process really well. So basically, Sunday Times list. So for those who don't know, the Sunday Times bestsellers list is like the kind of premier literary list in the UK. So similar to like the New York Times list. It's the UK's equivalent to the NYT bestsellers, right? And they have lots of different categories now, and it's published, funnily enough, in the Sunday Times, in the kind of culture supplement. And there's like a hardback bestsellers, there's a paperback bestsellers, there's a non-fiction bestsellers, and it's the top 10 in any given category. And what it does is it literally says the book, then it says how many it sold in that week. And it used to be the case, and it still is, to a large extent, that getting on the list, the Sunday Times list, or the New York Times list, or whatever, is like the pinnacle of the career. And it is, and it was wonderful. I think these days the landscape has changed slightly, and Sonia, you can talk about this more authoritatively than I can, but crates now form a huge part of that. So what you see with lists is it's often, as Sunny already said earlier in the podcast, it's your week one sales, your pre-orders, because you get a glut of pre-orders and your week one sales, which is an artificially high spike, and then naturally it trails off. And so most people will only get 1 week, in the list, unless you're a phenomenal bestseller. And it's normally the first week, so I don't think I can think of a single example where it's like your 5th or 6th week after publication that you suddenly hit the list. And so what happened with Justice of Kings was the Orbit was, putting some money behind it. They were marketing it, everything was going well. And then we went out for lunch, me and my agent and my editor in London. And we were talking about how basically what happened was Goldsborough Books, which is a independent bookshop in the centre of London. And they specialize in first editions, and obviously I know that you both know this. And they specialize in first editions, and what they tend to do these days is they do like lovely editions. They do like sprayed edges, and they do like, you sign it and you number it and whatever, and it's kind of like it's just kind of like induced demand, isn't it? It's like an artificial kind of scarcity, if you like. Special editions. It's the absolutely the business model that works, and they should have been doing it years ago, but it's kind of really reached its maturity now. And Goldsborough Books, the commissioning person who decides whether they do a Goldsborough edition, had decided they were going to do one for the Justice of Kings, and they had ordered 2,000. Now, 2,000 for the uninitiated is a phenomenally good number for a fantasy hardback. My agent told me most fantasy books will never. Well, first of all, most fantasy books don't get a hardback full stop, but those that do won't even sell 2,000 over the course of their lifetimes, let alone get this deal. I'm not saying that Justice of Kings is the best novel that's ever been written, obviously not, but it was a good number, and everyone was really happy with it. And that suddenly changed the thinking, because initially we had been going for, this is a good book, it's going to do well, we're going to give it a push, it's our lead debut title for this year, blah blah blah, to, well, maybe we can hit the bestseller list with this. And what it meant was, because not only were they doing a crate edition, but they were doing it, I shouldn't use the word crate because it wasn't part of a crate, it was just a special edition. Not only were they doing a special edition, but it was also going to be part of their Goldsborough subscription service. So Goldsborough did, I think it was last year or maybe the year before, you sign up, you pay them 20 or 30 quid a month, and they send you a book. They curate a list of books and they send you one. It's a beautiful first edition, signed, stamped, whatever. And Justice of Kings was going to go out in the February version of that. Now, February, so this is a real perfect storm for me. So February was, in a good way, February is a doldrums for media, generally speaking. Nothing much happens in February. So the lists were already quite depressed anyway. And so when Sunyi was talking earlier about Rowling and Osman and King hitting the list with like 50,000 sales week one or something, in February, I think, I have the copy of it somewhere here, but it was something like the number one was like maybe 5,000 or something. It wasn't, it was a lot, but it wasn't high, like super high. So it was very achievable. Suddenly we had the Goldsborough subscription, which was going to ship not all 2,000, but a large portion of them, certainly, maybe 1,000 or 1,500. There was the groundswell of support that Orbit had already put behind the book with their marketing money. And there was even talk very, very briefly, although it didn't happen, of a sales embargo, because as you both know, sometimes books, they kind of bleed out around the edges. Books will go on sale a week or two before the official publication date. And there was talk of maybe not letting that happen, putting what a sales embargo sounds a bit dramatic, and it was in the end for me. So that you physically prevent booksellers from selling it until the release date, because then again you artificially increase the sales for that crucial week one. But that didn't happen in the end. But lots of things conspired to happen, and I think it was the week of my editor, because I think the list gets published. Obviously, it comes out on Sunday, but I think they know by the Thursday before, or something like that. And so he was able to email me and say, congratulations, we've made the list on Sunday. And it was number 5, I think. It was number 5 on the hardback fiction. So it was wonderful. It was absolutely fantastic. Career high, book 1 straight out of the gate, Sunday Times, phenomenal. That will appear on every book I ever write now forever. Brilliant. But what it wasn't was Richard Swan has written an absolutely fucking incredible book, and everyone around the world just has to have a copy. It was actually a bit more. It was a bit more complex. Yeah, it was a bit more, there was some orchestration, there was some artificiality to it, and yeah, so the special edition certainly helped. There wouldn't have been a special edition if it wasn't a good book. So I don't want to kind of cut myself off at the knees. But having said that, if there hadn't been the Goldsboro edition, it wouldn't have hit the Sunday Times list. We would have sold maybe 1,000 week one, which is a fantastic number. But in the end, we sold like 2.5, which was enough to land in the middle of the list. So, it made a huge difference. And I think, and now you see, of course, and this is not to cheapen it at all, a lot of Sunday Times bestsellers and a lot of New York Times bestsellers is certainly for debuts or first books. And I think a lot of that is down to these crates, these special editions.
Yeah.
And Sonia, you can talk a lot more about that than I can.
Yeah, so there's a term I've heard for special editions, crates, and basically subscription services where you get either a book in it that's like a special version or just a regular version, and oftentimes some kind of paraphernalia and gadgets and things like that. And the term that I've heard for that is independent gatekeepers in relation to. So I know gatekeeper has a really negative context in on like Twitter, but they mean it in the way that Kidlit will talk about parents and teachers as being gatekeepers, basically people who control like which books get bought. The UK sci-fi and fantasy market is, I would say, dominated by independent gatekeepers at the moment, because Richard talked earlier about how bookstores buy books and they can return them. If a crate or subscription box or other independent gatekeeper buys books for their special edition, those are not returnable and those sales are guaranteed. And that means that they have a lot of power with publishers. You start seeing, if you're wondering why it seems like every new debut in the UK is hitting list, it's because the ones that are hitting list are often the ones that are picked for crates. And that means that publishers are then looking for books which are crate books. I mean, that's a whole podcast issue in itself of like, what is a crate book? And it's a very certain type of sci-fi and fantasy novel, which can cross into mainstream and cross age categories usually. But that's essentially what happened for me. Is Harper picked up the book, and they can't control this. They can only try. They have good relationships with crates. They pitched it to the crates. Crates have different tiers at which they'll buy the book, depending on how many of their subscribers they think will actually take it. But some of these crates are very big. So at the high end, like the very high end, you can shift 30K copies selling to a crate, which is fucking bananas. Like that's my entire American print run. At the even at the lower end in the UK, you're talking like 5 to 7 grand copies, which is still pretty bananas. And I won't say how many I got with the Lumicrate because that information is actually protected. But May of last year, I was signing books for Illumicrate and Broken Binding. And then because of that interest from those crates, Waterstones, which I don't think was very keen on me at the start, finally got in on it. It was like, okay, we'll make a special edition too. So in total, there were about 22,000 special edition books of some kind or another with different companies in the UK for book eaters, which is, again, fucking bananas and really blew my mind. I went to a concert once,
presumably
1,000 people, and I couldn't cope with it. So, yeah, wrists as well. Yeah, well, actually, it was not the wrist; it's the pad of your hand from signing. And that, so we found out basically in December that I'd gotten to one of these independent gatekeeper crates, and another author who I won't name here said that means you're going to hit list because that's how it works in the UK now. And it's funny actually because of release dates moving around and things. Actually, the crate sales didn't count till later in the month for me. I think in the middle of that J.K. Rowling, Stephen King storm, but it did push up interest and buzz enough that we hit list anyway on pre-orders and I think Broken Binding sales.
Right.
So, when people are wondering like why do some books just seem to step off the debut platform and fly straight into the lists, because there's like a whole system built around elevating books to that list. And if you're not in that system, if you don't have the buzz, you don't have the crates and all this, it's really, I can't it's really hard for debut books to do that. I'm not sure how you would do it, other than very fluky cases like Iron Widow, where that, Zero, and they managed to get an amazing social media platform, stuff like that. I will say one thing for craze, because this is starting to sound a bit cynical. I do think some things about them are really good, and one of them is that I know that like Illumicrate will read books from smaller publishers. They don't just pick up the buzziest book, and in fact, some of the buzziest books are too buzzy for them, because it won't net them enough sales or interest. So you sometimes see these books come out of Illumicrate, and I was like, "Who the fuck is that? What?" Oh, and it's like with a smaller publisher, and it's a less known book that they've read and they've loved, and they thought, "Yeah, we should put that in our subscription box." So it can be a way out, for someone with the mid-sized press, but it's also very, it is changing the market noticeably. There's a lot of talk, at least from my friends who are on sub in the past couple of years, from UK agents about like, is this a crate book? We think this is a crate book. Will crates like it? Can you make it more like a crate book? I'm not sure how that's going to go for us long term. But that is the story of how, and I as well, like, I don't think my publisher is evil for doing this. If your publisher is working its ass off to get you on lists, to get you sales, they're doing what they should be doing, and that's a good thing. They
Absolutely.
didn't make the system; they're just trying to work with it as best they can. But I realize how disheartening that description of the system must sound to people who don't know.
I think it comes down to what your goal is, doesn't it? There was a discussion on Twitter not long ago about, what is it taboo to want success as an author? Because for the longest time for me, writing was an end in itself. Before I started self-publishing in earnest, I only wrote for myself, and I just enjoyed the process of writing and getting my ideas down on the page. And then when I generated an audience for myself, then it became about writing for the reader rather than for me. Now it's about, well, I want to be a successful author. I want to be part of the zeitgeist. I want to have a big readership. I want to make lots of money from my books. And I also enjoy writing books. And I don't think any of those things are mutually exclusive. But I think if your goal, for the longest time for me, my goal was, my life's ambition is I want to get one book in print. I want to get one book with a publisher and publish, and then that can never be taken away from me. Like, I will be a published author then, no matter what happens. I will die a published author. Now the goalposts have completely shifted, of course, for me personally. But it is disheartening if your ultimate end goal is, I want to be a massive, successful, like, household author with like 10,000, 20,000 sales to my name, sure, then that's going to be very difficult. If your goal is, I just want to get a book out in the world, and if I reach just one person, that will be enough for me, then of course you're immune to the broader vicissitudes of the industry. I suspect more people want the former than the latter, but someone will want the latter, I'm sure.
I mean, just speaking from the point of view of someone who's basically lived on the poverty line for most of my life, having money is fucking fantastic. I do recommend it. Oh my gosh.
Money is great.
I mean, people shouldn't be embarrassed about wanting to be financially successful. And this is a financial enterprise, right? Like, people are paying real money to buy these books from publishers who are paying, well, they're not paying the people who do the actual work very well, but the people at the top are getting really good paychecks.
Absolutely. He stopped himself before he went a little too far. But they're all really good people at an individual level.
Well, the people that we met.
Yes. Yeah. Well, and that's the thing, right? Is like, when you're dealing with these publishers and things aren't going quite the way you want, it's very clear that there are forces you don't understand at work.
Yep.
And that I at least may never understand. But my point was only that authors, in my opinion, should not be embarrassed at all to have a goal of, I want to do this for a living, and not just do it for a living, but I want to be comfortable financially, or I want to be rich as hell, right? Like, that's fine. That's great.
Sure.
People in every industry do that. Like, this is a commercial industry, and people don't treat it like that. And because they don't, there is as mentioned previously also, there's a huge supply of people who are just happy to see their name on a book, and that's a life accomplishment and great. But that's not the totality of this industry. It should be a money-making enterprise for all involved.
Agreed.
Yeah.
Also,
I'm sorry.
I just wanted to briefly mention, because you talked a lot about the Sunday Times and how it depends heavily on special editions and crates and everything. And this is probably a separate episode as well, or several. But I think it's worth mentioning, and Sonia, you in particular can probably tell us more about this, but it's worth mentioning that the US market doesn't quite function the same, right? There aren't really large crates, at least that I know of. There aren't huge special edition producers that are swaying the market. It does seem like more of a free-for-all on the US side, right?
Yeah, it does. I mean, so a big crate purchase in the US side is like 2 or 3,000 books, but it's probably, I think we were in a couple of crates for the US side. It was like 300 or 400 books, which is great, but it's not like 7 to 20,000, which is what you get on the UK side.
Right.
I felt like it was more of a free for all. It was more dependent on trade reviews and independent bookstore recommendations. I don't actually know how you would go about hitting list in the States. I think we would have to find an author who's done that and talk to them about that in depth.
Yeah.
I suspect there's more to it that goes on than what it looks like on the outside, if the UK side is any judge.
Yeah. All right, we have now reached the portion of our podcast where we ask Richard to sing his favorite song to us.
It's called Authors Karaoke. Spin up
Just
that
kidding.
track.
Sorry. Go ahead, Sunny. Sorry.
No, it's fine. I've completely forgot what I was going to say now. Oh yeah,
Scott,
Damn it, I ruined
goodness
it.
sake.
this is something that Richard was talking about actually the other day. I was thinking about how, it's not like we're not stupid, right? Like, and I think publishers have a tendency to kind of, either out of compassion for our egos or just it's easier to manage us, they have a tendency to assume that writers don't want to know stuff. And no writer I've ever met has felt like that. So it's just frustrating, because I think if they were honest and upfront, I mean, Richard even suggested, like, if they're approaching people saying, look, you've got a tier 1 book deal, a tier 2 book deal, a tier 3 book deal, this is what it
Exactly.
means, this is what we commit to, I think people would sign that. I think they would still get people saying, fine, I'm happy to be mid-list. I know what it means. I know what's expected of me. I know what my limits are and what I will and won't get pitched for.
Mhm.
Yeah. I mean, for most people, it's the difference between having a book deal and having nothing. So, people will, I think, in most cases, accept. I remember Orbit
Yeah.
once saying, our goal is to be the number one choice for science fiction and fantasy authors. And I just remember thinking to myself, people will just take any deal they can get. It's not like, I'm just actually swimming in like 10 publishing deals, but I'm going to go to Orbit because they're the premier kind of. It's like, well, I've got one deal, so yes, I'm going to accept it. I mean, it just made me laugh at how kind of the idea that all these authors are just kind of like choosing which publisher they want to go to because they've sort of positioned themselves in that way. But yeah, absolutely. I think if as you said, if a publishing house said, okay, this is our tier 1 title, so we're going to give you this big advance and you're going to get all of our money, or this is your tier 2 title, it's we're going to do social media marketing only and blah blah, and you can only you can move up a tier, but we guarantee you'll never move down. This is a kind of a baseline of attention and money spent on you. I think people would respond really well to that. But I think it's just a huge part of it. It's just that natural tendency of human beings to want to avoid having awkward conversations with one another.
Yes.
And ultimately, it's, as I sort of alluded to earlier, no one really wants to think about a book publishing deal as a commercial transaction, because you're mixing creativity with commerciality. And of course, it's both. But publisher is interested in commerciality, and you're interested in creativity, and those two often lock horns. And so more often than not, they won't just come out and say, well, we don't like this because it doesn't tick these commerciality boxes for us. We can't sell this aspect of the novel, blah blah blah, because you're like, but that's how I've expressed my allegory. I've expressed it in this way, and it means whatever. So it's they're uncomfortable bedfellows, and nothing's going to change that in the near future. But certainly like upfront communication about the nature of the relationship would alleviate so much of, I think, author kind of ill feeling in the industry.
Yeah, I think that would be huge. The other part of why I think it doesn't happen and probably won't is that then, if they had very specific and detailed tiers of what they were committing to, they'd then have to do that, right?
Yeah, that's true. Legal obligations, yeah.
Yeah. Whereas now, there's zero accountability, really, on the corporate side, and as far as the corporation is concerned, that's perfect.
It's just more art than science, isn't it? In so many cases.
Yeah.
Yeah, and in a couple of weeks, I'm actually going to bring someone on who was promised to be a lead title by a particular publisher, and that did not work out for her. So, I mean, even when it's in contract, stuff is not protected, which sucks. But at least you would have, you can have that to hold against them. You said this, and it was written down.
Yeah.
Anyway.
Right.
Someday.
Yeah. I don't know if you have anything further, Scott. I'll probably have to trim some of this, but that was a ton.
Yeah, that was
Thank you, Richard.
very good.
No, my pleasure. If you want to, cut it down to just one episode, I don't mind, and just kind of take out the salient points. Do whatever you need to do. It's
Well, we'll see, because I don't want to lose all of it, and I mean, I find the craft interesting. We'll listen to it again and see how long individual sections are and stuff. But I think it would be hard to fit all of the business stuff into like it's going to be tough. Yeah,
2 sort of 35-minute episodes, can you, or 2 40-minute episodes? I mean, how long is an episode? Keep meaning to. I will listen to them.
They've been 45 to 60 minutes. I think the longest was an hour and 10. But it's flexible. I'll look at it and see like if there's a natural dividing point, because that might be easier if we're releasing in batches anyway.
Yeah.
I mean, in
at
recording,
this point, I don't feel people are gonna stop listening just because